place to work, study, and live. And as the region has changed, and so too has Canada. In this year of celebrations across the country and here at Durham College, we're looking to the future and celebrating the past, which is why Governor Poloz's visit is so well timed. We look forward to hearing his perspective on Canada's economic journey and lessons we can draw from. So Stephen S. Poloz was appointed Governor of Banque du Canada effective June 3rd, 2013, for a term of 7 years. As Governor, he is also the chairman of the board of the directors of the bank and a member of the board of directors of the Bank of International Settlements. Born in Oshawa, welcome home, Ontario, the Governor graduated from Queen's University in 1978 with a bachelor's degree in economics. He received a master's degree in economics in 1979 and a PhD in economics in 1982, both from the University of Western Ontario. Governor Poloz has taught economics at the University of Western Ontario, Concordia University, and Queen's School of Business. He resides in Ottawa with his wife, Valerie. He has 2 children, Jessica and Nicholas, and he's a grandfather. Lucky you. It's wonderful to be a grandfather. So welcome to the podium and welcome to Durham College, Governor.
Well, thank you very much, Don. That's very kind. It is a real pleasure to be back in my hometown of Oshawa, and particularly at a time when Durham College is reaching its 50th anniversary. So I was telling Don this morning, believe it or not, I remember exactly when Durham opened its doors, and that's probably an unusual story for a guy that must have been awfully young at the time. But I remember well when it opened because the college didn't have any residences at that time. And so the college advertised in the newspaper for places to stay for the arriving students. So my mother stepped up and we had 3 fellows from Durham stay with us that year. And boy, I can tell you, we ate really well that year. Plus, of course, the Leafs won the Stanley Cup that year, right? So it's a memorable year. So from just 205 students that year, 3 of which stayed at our place, Durham has flourished. And the college does, of course, develop partnerships with Trent and with York, added UOIT as an educational partner. And today, Durham College has over 50,000 alumni, which is very impressive. So as we all know, Canada, too, is hitting a big milestone this year, 150 years of Confederation. So let me ask you this. Where in the world would you rather live? It's a very serious question. I mean, over the past 150 years, which actually is not that long by global standards, Canada has progressed to become one of the wealthiest and happiest countries in the world. The average income today, adjusted for inflation, is about 20 times what it was at Confederation. And it's worth thinking about how this progress arose. Essentially, Canada's economic growth up to around World War II depended primarily on exploiting our natural resources. And to accomplish this, we needed 3 things: foreign investment, immigration, and access to foreign markets. In short, we needed to be open to the world. Of course, being open to the world also meant that Canada would be affected by global events, including policies in other countries. And sometimes this has caused us to question our commitment to openness. But over time, the evidence leads to a clear conclusion. Canada fares better when we're open. And today I want to illustrate this by looking at 6 episodes in our history to talk about how our willingness to be open to trade, investment, and people has ebbed and flowed over the years. Now, the economic benefits of international trade have been understood for at least 200 years. But trade itself has been going on throughout history, including here in North America. At numerous sites, such as at the junction of the Gatineau and the Ottawa rivers, near where Parliament Hill is, you can find evidence of trading that stretches back centuries. Goods and better methods of producing goods spread via trade among First Nations, such as the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, on whose traditional territories Durham College sits today. Now, trade grew even more following the arrival of Europeans. The colonial powers of Britain and France had a strong interest in Canada's natural resources. So trade in resources like fish and furs and timber, which was established long before Confederation, shaped how Canada would develop. This is described by Harold Innes in his, well, it's about 80 years ago, in his seminal studies of our economic history. So rather than begin the story in 1867, it's appropriate to set the scene, to go back a little further, and to see how actually Confederation took place. So in the years following the War of 1812, remember that one, eh? The area that would unite at Confederation was still divided into 4 colonies. Upper Canada, part of Ontario, Lower Canada, which is the lower part of Quebec, and the maritime colonies of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, so the 4 of them. And at the time, our economic ties with the U.S. were, well, frayed. No doubt that had much to do with the fact that the Americans had just tried to invade Canada. But they'd also imposed high tariffs on our exports to the United States. Now, in contrast, we had very strong ties to Britain, which had a policy of preferential tariffs. That is, very low taxes levied on their imports from their colonies, such as Canada. So tariffs at that time served a dual purpose. Up until around World War I, governments relied on tariffs on the movement of goods for most of their revenue. That's where the money came from. But the second purpose of tariffs, which is a more deep one, was to protect domestic businesses from foreign competition. Now, over the years, there's always been a tension between those who sought higher tariffs to provide protection from import competition and those who advocated lower tariffs and open markets. And in Canada, this tension often had a regional component. Consumers outside the protected industries didn't like paying higher prices because of the high tariffs. And this tension has ebbed and flowed for the past 200 years. So during the first episode of our story, economic growth for the colonies depended on shipping resources, primarily, not exclusively, to Britain. In Upper and Lower Canada, this meant building canals, such as the Welland Canal and the Lachine Canal, so that goods could move. Immigration from Europe was crucial to supply the labor needed for the construction, and with very little local capital to finance the projects, governments looked abroad, mainly to Britain as well, for foreign investment. The uniting of Upper and Lower Canada in 1841 was an important step in attracting the funds needed to build the canals, and gave it more credibility. That the canals that would allow ships to travel efficiently from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. That new waterway allowed wheat shipments from Upper Canada to boom. It also attracted shipments of U.S. grain, because Britain considered everything that was sent along the St. Lawrence River to be Canadian. Okay, same tariff, regardless of where it actually came from. So by the early 1840s, our colonies were making good economic progress, aided by foreign investment, lots of immigration, and of course trade with the British Empire. But this business model was disrupted. 1846, when the British government eliminated all tariffs on grain imports. This was to reduce prices in Britain for food. What that meant was that grain shipped through the St. Lawrence no longer had a preference over, say, shipments from New York. And so Canada lost this important bit of leverage. Well, so that disruption brings us to our second episode, and these were the years that led to Confederation. The hard feelings from the War of 1812 had pretty much faded away. The Canadian colonies reacted to this loss of preferential access to Britain by becoming more open to trade with the United States. And after several years of negotiations, and after overcoming significant protectionist sentiment on both sides of the border, the province of Canada struck a reciprocity agreement with the U.S. in 1854. In essence, this was a free trade agreement, but just in resources. Meanwhile, the Irish famine had touched off waves of immigration into the colonies and into the U.S., and that was fueling economic growth both sides of the border. The colonies actively sought foreign investment to support the construction of railways, so the goods could move not just in summer, but also in winter. And most of the investment to finance these projects, again, came from overseas, primarily from Britain. So with growing trade, an expanding population, foreign investment, and improved transportation links in the colonies, the years just before Confederation were generally a time of economic growth. There was a problem, though. The fiscal cost of supporting the railroads was very high. And the province of Canada only had one source of revenue, and that was tariffs. So they found themselves forced to raise their revenues by raising tariffs on imported factory goods. And not surprisingly, this did not sit well with the manufacturers in the northern United States. This resentment grew over the years, especially because Britain continued to trade with the southern United States all throughout the U.S. Civil War. After the war, the northern states were in the driver's seat, and protectionist sentiment carried the day. And so at the end of the Civil War, the U.S. backed out of the Reciprocity Treaty with Canada in 1866. So once again, Canada's business model was disrupted, and we lost preferential access to a really important market. So this set of circumstances was the key driver to the event that we are celebrating this year, the founding of the Dominion of Canada 150 years ago. So back in 1867, we became a nation of 3.5 million people, and more than 80% of the workforce were involved in agriculture or other natural resources. So our third episode begins then, Confederation. U.S. access to the U.S. market was restricted by these high tariffs. Canada needed railways more than ever just to trade with itself, within Canada, to move goods and people long distances, east and west, rather than north and south. So it's no exaggeration to say that without railways, there simply would not have been a Dominion of Canada. In the east, construction of the intercolonial railway was a condition for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to join Confederation in the first place. So they needed to be connected. And in the west, amid American dreams of northern expansion, the Canadian government needed a railroad to assert sovereignty over the prairies. And it enticed the colony of British Columbia to join Confederation with the promise of a transcontinental railway, a big commitment. So when completed, Canada would have railways running from sea to sea. The nation and its economy simply would not have worked without them. Now, building a railway with an all-Canadian route over the vast Canadian Shield would be tremendously difficult and expensive. And to get this done, Canada again had to turn to foreign investment to help fund construction. So over its first 20 years, Canada was routinely running current account deficits of between 7 and 10% of GDP, financed by foreign borrowing. Now this wasn't today if we had that would be something, but this wasn't a problem because all that borrowing was being used to increase the economy's capacity. And to complete the railroad, the government turned to a group that included Donald Smith, who you know probably as Lord Strathcona, and his cousin, George Stephen. George Stephen was president of the Bank of Montreal, and as it happens, an ancestor of mine, as Stephen is my mother's family name. Now, just as there would be no Dominion without the railroad, it's fair to say there would be no railroad without the effort and skill of these early entrepreneurs and financiers who helped attract the foreign capital and channel it to where it was needed. The people who developed what was to become the world's soundest banking system were vital to Canada's development. In fact, the Bank of Montreal, which by the way is celebrating its 200th year this year, served as the fiscal agent for the Canadian government, like the Bank of Canada does today, in the years right after Confederation. That's a role the Bank of Canada fulfills routinely today, but back then it was the Bank of Montreal that did so. Now, the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed by 1885. Huge effort that opened up the West to goods and people. This link may have been necessary for growth, but of course it wouldn't be enough on its own. In fact, at the time while the railway was being constructed, the world was in the grips of the Victorian Depression. This was a generation-long economic slump, much longer than the Great Depression in the 1930s, It followed the financial crisis of 1873 and basically went up to about 1898. Now, looking back on the period, it's a wonder that the CPR was completed during such difficult times. Even though thousands of immigrants continued to arrive in Canada each year, an even greater number of people were leaving Canada to go to the United States, where economic conditions seemed better. So in these difficult circumstances, the Canadian government turned insular. Weak revenues and concerns about the future of manufacturing led it to raise tariffs. By 1890, the average Canadian tariff for manufactured goods had reached 23%. Imported clothing was subject to a tariff of 30%. So people are paying 30 or 23% more than the world price for all of their goods. Even so, growth remained very modest until just before the end of the century. So the tide turned in our fourth episode, which begins just at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the railroads that now crisscrossed the land supported openness in both directions. They allowed the trickle of immigrants into the West to turn into a flood. And they were the conduit for rapidly growing exports. With rising grain prices, Canada's income soared. On the tariff front, the U.S. market remained essentially closed to us. And in the 1911 elections, Canadian voters rejected a renewed attempt at a reciprocity treaty with the U.S. But Canada's natural inclination toward open markets gradually asserted itself. The government launched what became known as the imperial preference, which allowed for tariff rebates on goods of British origin. And over time, Canada pointed the way toward openness by negotiating lower tariffs through what we now call most favored nation agreements with several other countries. Today, the concept of most favored nation is at the heart of the global trading system. So with tariffs starting to trend downward globally, market access rising, population growth accelerating, the Canadian economy boomed early in the century. Foreign investment remained a key ingredient, hitting a record 18% of GDP in 1911. By 1913, more than $2 billion had been invested in railways in Canada alone. Now that would be equal to something like $43 billion today. And that was in a country of just 7.5 million people. It's extraordinary. Another important trend began to emerge during this period. Our economy was becoming much more diverse. Canada's manufacturing sector, centered here in southern Ontario, began to expand rapidly. Several factors helped this rise, including the development of technologies that raised productivity in agriculture, which allowed workers to leave farms for emerging jobs in cities. In the fledgling auto industry, Ford opened its first Canadian plant in Walkerville in 1904. And here in Oshawa, McLaughlin Carriage Company began making cars in 1907. As you know, I guess, McLaughlin later merged with Buick, and that became General Motors. But this industrialization would, in time, help encourage a more open trading relationship between Canada and the U.S. Well, that brings us to our fifth episode, which begins at the outbreak of World War I and continues until World War II. The First World War led to higher tariffs, of course. That's how governments scrambled to raise revenue. Income tax was first introduced as a temporary measure, by the way. Just like the temporary building Don was talking about. The temporary building that's just now being replaced, right? If the income tax was first introduced temporarily in 1917, and that finally gave governments another source of revenue. And it also did another thing. It meant that tariffs could be what they really were, which is purely a tool of protectionism, not a tool to raise money. So foreign investment into Canada slowed sharply in this situation. Immigration came almost to a halt. A major recession followed World War I. Now, things improved briefly during the Roaring '20s amid industrialization in both Canada and the U.S., but the U.S. stock market crashed famously in 1929, and shortly afterward, the Western world fell into the Great Depression. Now, foreign investment and immigration to Canada slowed again even more during the Depression. From 1929 to 32, Canada's economy shrank by 25%. 25%. With public sentiment turning against the banking system, then Prime Minister R.B. Bennett set up a royal commission leading to the establishment of a central bank to act in the public's interest. And since 1935, the Bank of Canada, my institution, has been operating with a mandate to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada. Well, meanwhile, in a bid to protect American workers and farmers from foreign competition, the U.S. Congress pushed up the average tariff on dutiable goods to nearly 60% by 1932. This policy backfired spectacularly. Most other countries, including Canada, retaliated with tariffs of their own to keep a level playing field. The trade war, of course, had no winners. Everyone suffered as international shipments collapsed. Canadian trade fell by more than 50% during the Depression. U.S. trade by 70%. And unhappily, World War II is what happened next. So our final episode follows World War II. So after the Depression and the war, many countries, including Canada, were determined to create international institutions aimed at preventing such disasters from ever happening again. So at the 1944 conference at Bretton Woods, Canadian economist, future Bank of Canada governor, Lou Razminski, not only led much of the drafting, but also helped to break deadlocks between the British and the U.S. delegations. Canada would benefit greatly from this international push toward openness. A consensus emerged on the wisdom of an open trading system. And 3 years after Bretton Woods, we saw GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Over the next 50 years, successive rounds of GATT talks led to lower and lower tariffs, starting from around 22% on average before the war to about 4% following the Uruguay round in the 1990s, reducing the costs for consumers everywhere. Here in Canada, the government cooperated with the U.S. government to invest almost $500 million in the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it invested another $1 billion to build the Trans-Canada Highway. And just to get an idea of what these figures would be today, multiply them by roughly 10. The pattern of importing capital resumed, while the banking industry, along with the Bank of Canada, facilitated the development of local financial markets. These markets would provide a link to global financial markets and help attract and channel foreign capital. So during the 1950s and 1960s, large numbers of people immigrated to Canada. And this has continued to be the case, more or less, until today. Now, some simple arithmetic shows just how important immigration has been to Canada. If you take away the force of international migration since Confederation, Canada would be around 10 million people today, not 36 million, which we are. With all the right ingredients in place, Canada enjoyed years of sustained, strong economic growth in the post-war period. So it's no surprise that some of Canada's most famous economists made their mark during this time. So I'm thinking of Nobel laureate Robert Mundell, whose work with British economist Marcus Fleming led to a greater understanding of how small economies like ours, open economies such as Canada's, function, and why flexible exchange rates are a key ingredient of success, especially for an economy reliant on foreign capital. Other Canadian economists who gained prominence around this time include John Kenneth Galbraith with his international work and insights into economic cycles, financial bubbles, and Jacob Viner and Harry Johnson, both of whom did pioneering work on international trade. Now, with industrialization continuing during the post-war period, Canada's economic ties with the U.S. strengthened. The 1965 Auto Pact, very important to this region, created a single, tightly linked market for automobiles and parts between the two countries. This gave Canadian producers the opportunity to develop economies of scale and the ability to specialize their production. And over the agreement's first 40 years, auto production in Canada roughly tripled, while employment in the industry doubled. The next step in strengthening these ties was the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement in 1988, which was expanded 5 years later to include Mexico in NAFTA. And as had been the case in earlier attempts at reciprocity, these agreements would not come easily. Many Canadians resisted continental free trade. They feared job losses, the possible loss of our healthcare system, a general loss of Canadian economic or even political sovereignty. Now, none of these concerns have come to pass, although heightened competition did result in job losses in some sectors. But these losses were more than offset by gains in other areas, and consumers everywhere have continued to benefit from lower prices and increased purchasing power as most tariffs were eliminated. Beyond the FTA and NAFTA, Canada has kept pursuing other opportunities for openness. Canada has continued to push for reduced barriers through the World Trade Organization, which of course succeeded the GATT, and through agreements with other individual countries or trading blocs. So, what can we say about the lessons of this story? How can we apply them today? Now, I know I've greatly oversimplified matters. I've not taken into account a host of other factors in Canada's development. But I find the correlation between economic progress and openness to be striking. When trade barriers are falling, when people are coming to our shores, and when investment is rising, Canadians prosper. We saw this before Confederation. We saw it in the early 1900s, and we saw it after World War II. The flip side is that responding to tough economic times by turning inward rarely succeeds. We saw this immediately after Confederation, and we saw it during the Great Depression. The bottom line of our history is that openness and economic progress go hand in hand. Now, it's intuitive that a country like Canada would want open access to foreign markets. Indeed, given our abundance of natural resources, we've needed export markets to pay for the imports and the investment required for our development. Similarly, it isn't hard to see how we've been bolstered by a growing population that includes immigrants who bring their skills, labor, and demand. And Canada is not unique in this. But it's less intuitive to see the same point from the other direction. Historically, there's always been some resistance within Canada to lowering tariffs and exposing our businesses to foreign competition. But what this experience has shown is that the fears of openness are misplaced. Protectionism does not promote growth, and its costs are steep. First and foremost, higher tariffs and other trade barriers make things more expensive for people and limit their choices, while lower tariffs make things cheaper and increase choice. Specific companies may benefit from protectionism, but that imposes a cost on everyone. Conversely, the gains from free trade are spread throughout the entire economy. Now, beyond this, exposure to competition has been an important driver of innovation. Through competition, companies are exposed to new technologies, which they can then adapt for their own use. And higher productivity leads to sustained employment and rising living standards. So there are compelling reasons why Canada should continue pushing for open markets, both here and abroad. Similarly, there are compelling reasons to keep our borders open to immigration. Now, last month, Statistics Canada issued a report projecting that in less than 30 years, Canada will rely entirely on immigration to keep its population growing. Along with productivity, we need continued labor force growth to keep our economic potential expanding. Now, there are also compelling reasons to ensure that Canada remains open to foreign capital flows. Because of our vast geography and relatively small population, we've always had major infrastructure needs. Historically, our domestic savings base has never been large enough to finance these infrastructure projects, so we've needed foreign capital. Now, a final related point. This quick romp through our history illustrates the importance of dreamers and visionaries, leaders who can turn difficult odds into win-win outcomes. In short, success is not guaranteed, but the key ingredients must be there for the entrepreneurial to capitalize upon: open markets, immigration, foreign investment. Allow me to conclude. Canada's development owes much to people who had a vision of what it takes to build a great nation and the willingness to take risks to achieve that goal. Our history shows that it takes a world to raise a nation. And nation building works best in an environment of openness for trade, people, and investment. Now, this is one of my most important messages today, so please let me repeat it in our other official language for those francophones who are listening in. Le développement du Canada est en grande partie attribuable aux personnes qui ont su voir ce qui était essentiel à la construction d'une grande nation et qui étaient prêtes à prendre des risques pour atteindre cet objectif. Notre histoire montre qu'il faut tout un monde pour bâtir une nation et qu'on obtient les meilleurs résultats dans un environnement d'ouverture aux échanges commerciaux, aux personnes et aux investissements. Now, Canada has prospered by looking outward and being engaged bilaterally and multilaterally. Now, it can be hard to remember this in times of global stress, such as we've seen in recent years. The quest for progress and higher productivity can disrupt people's lives. Automation has meant that workers in specific industries have borne the cost of change in a very difficult, concentrated, personal way. And we can expect this to continue. But remember that we've been through similar technological disruptions before. And turning inward has never been the answer. Rather, committing to openness has always been the right choice. And what's crucial now is that we deploy some of the benefits of being open to assist those who need help adjusting to those global forces. Failing to do so invites doubt and puts everyone's progress at risk. Now, Canada's prospered over its first 150 years. Mistakes have been made, lessons have been learned. But overall, our openness to the world has helped us build a nation that I believe is the best place to live in the world. Just imagine what we can build over the next 150 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Governor. Is this not on? On now? Thank you, Governor. We have set aside 10 minutes for questions and answers, and I'll moderate this session. But before we start that, you know, every once in a while you make those career-limiting moves, and I did forget a very special VIP in the room to introduce, and that's our chair of the board, Pierre Tremblay. And I want to keep my job, so welcome, Pierre. Nice to have you here. So, do we have questions for the Governor? Yes. You want to introduce yourself and ask your question, please? And we have a roaming microphone. Because we are streaming. Okay.
Welcome and thank you again for your talk today. My name is Chris Vail, president here of the Durham College Alumni Association. And given your incredible career success that you've had, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Well, next question. That's a good question. All right, and I guess in my time, I mean, things have moved fast enough. But when I look out the window now, things are moving so much faster. When I think about the technologies that we take for granted today, I remember typing my PhD thesis on an IBM Selectric and being so excited because you could change the ball, you know, to do the math symbols. And, you know, if you made a mistake, you had to retype the whole page because they had to be perfect pages for your thesis. No editing on the screen and then just print it later, you know. And we just take that stuff for granted. Just this one example. But so I think the pace of change is such that if I was giving myself advice, again, it would be to, instead of going to university and or college to learn specific things, it would be about learning to learn. So it's more about tools as opposed to apps, if you get the distinction. So, I mean, I went because I thought, oh, I'm going to be a doctor, and then I fell in love with economics. Next thing you know, I'm a doctor of a different type. But the point is that I found something I really loved, got lucky. And I think today, you know, so many jobs that, like, if you're in school now, the job you'll be doing 10 years from now, you have no idea what it might be. You want to have those opportunities in front of you. So it's about learning to learn, so learning tools so that you're adaptable to change as it goes by, so you're able to create opportunities. So I think I would have kept more options open. If I was doing it again, if I was starting now, for sure I would keep more options open to myself. But I was like screaming for the I wanted, my specialty. I knew what I wanted to do, and I got really lucky. So.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, Peter Stasiak. We did meet briefly earlier. So my economics classes this week are about open trade versus trade protectionism, so pretty timely that you're here to talk about that today. We're kind of on the same page, but I have a few questions. First of all...
Sorry, kind of on the same page?
We're on the same page. We're on the same page.
I'm not sure what that means.
We're definitely on the same page. So these remarks and the emphasis on open trade, I suspect, are going hand in hand with other countries, and maybe... Is this a little bit of a response to some of the positions we're hearing from the President of the United States? I can't quite recall his name, but there's two things. One is the issue of trade and how there are some talks about renegotiating or looking at different parts of NAFTA. Yeah. Are there specific areas of NAFTA that we expect the United States will want to talk about? And they have recently just increased their interest rates. Is that going to influence what the Bank of Canada might do in April? So I have two questions.
Okay. Well, so certainly I think that whenever there is a tendency towards protectionism, it's often the case that people just kind of forget the benefits of openness. The fact that we have free trade agreements in place may mean you pay, I don't know, say 30% less for a garment than you would if there wasn't a free trade agreement in place. But that was a long time ago, and it's just become part of your baseline. You don't really think about it much. So, but if we were to reverse that tomorrow, it would be a huge impact on your well-being. Say you had to pay 20% more for every article of clothing that you bought. Well, that would be a significant hit to your spending power. And that's just clothing. There's all kinds of things that could be put tariffs on. So people lose sight of the baseline, and therefore at times they think, oh, a little protection wouldn't hurt. Kind of protect this, protect that, protect this, protect that. And so the answer is no. History tells us that it is not a recipe for progress. So the timing of this discussion is not accidental. It's not specific to developments in the U.S. It's actually specific to a global kind of retrenchment in thinking that, openness is somehow not working for everybody. And analyses have shown that it is not openness which is putting stress on people. It is technology that is putting stress on people. And we cannot protect ourselves from technology, nor would we probably want to. We don't want to have 80% of us working on the farms again. That's just not how we're going to satisfy our aspirations. So bottom line is, we are in an era where probably there will be some changes to trade architecture. You mentioned NAFTA. NAFTA is, it's 20 years old. Actually, it's old. NAFTA, yes, it's 24 years old. And so there are things in NAFTA that are incomplete. So softwood lumber is not in NAFTA. The rules of origin are pretty complicated and so on. So there may be things that could be done to improve NAFTA. I welcome a dust off, if you like, of NAFTA in that basic sense. But that's what should happen with those kinds of agreements, because it was not a pure free trade agreement. It was a heavily negotiated agreement. The last part of your question is interest rates. Well, yes, the U.S. has already begun to raise interest rates. I think the important thing for people to remember is what matters is the differences between Canada and the U.S., not in growth rate terms. The economies are growing, more or less similarly, I guess, a little bit, close enough to the same. But Canada has a lot more room to grow because we have not recovered fully from the oil price shock. It was a major setback for us. So we have a level difference between the two economies. More unemployment, more excess capacity, a cushion there, which means that we can grow faster than the U.S. for a while to use up that capacity. And so we're, in effect, behind the U.S. in that process of getting back to normal. So I think people need to remember that as they ask these questions about interest rates. I'm not going to answer a specific question about interest rates, obviously. But that's the background to that decision.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, question over here. And then the gentleman here. And the woman with, yes.
Hi, my name is Diego Garcia. I'm a political science student at UIT. And my question is with regards to the common themes today about economic progress, and it goes hand in hand with openness. I wanted to speak a little bit about the directionality of the Canadian economy and its relation to student unemployment and the job market for students. So my question is, do you see it improve it or not? And does the Bank of Canada have a responsibility, if any, navigating with these issues?
With the employment situation?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, yes, I mean, the Bank of Canada is working under a long-term, 25 years agreement with the government to use a target for inflation as its primary goal. And that underneath that premise is a belief that the inflation rate would only be stable at 2% if the rest of the economy is back where it belongs to. So if there is, like we have right now, excess capacity, unemployment is above normal, youth unemployment is higher than normal because of what we've been through. If nothing else was happening, the rate of inflation would have a tendency to drift down through time and fall below our 2% target. So for us, in order to keep inflation at around 2%, requires that the economy evolves so that those excess capacity gets used up, which means that people who are looking for work get jobs, companies expand, et cetera. So those things kind of go together as we actually call it the divine coincidence, that you don't get the stable inflation rate without everything else working too. So that is our objective, and so it's why the interest rate is quite low right now. It's to give the economy extra room to grow. I have people that say to me, well, interest rates aren't doing much. The economy hasn't been growing very fast. It's true that if interest rates were this low 10 years ago, we think the economy would be exploding higher, right? But fact is, the financial crisis of 2007-08 has left us a legacy, and the recession that followed, that makes it almost like we're riding a bike up a hill. And so if you think, you're riding a bike up a hill and it's really tough going, your legs are going as best you can, and you're getting that burning sensation and so on, well, you think, well, this bike isn't working. That's not what you conclude. What you conclude is I'm going up a hill. And if you don't believe me, just stop pedaling and see what happens, right? And if we were to raise interest rates back to normal prematurely, like today, the economy would, I'm certain, have a recession. And that's because we're still pushing up a hill. So that's an important thing to remember too. So in the end, all of these things, we're confident that we can see the forces of nature working, the equilibration forces, as economists would call them. And so they're just acting more slowly than they have in past cycles because of the reasons I've mentioned. And so as we watch them unfold, we'll see the economy gradually use up its excess capacity, and inflation will be stable there, and there will be jobs for the new grads.
We're out of time, but we'll allow one more question.
Oh,
This
yeah,
gentleman here had his hand up first, and that'll be our last question. Thank you.
So I made my answers too long.
No,
Sorry,
they're great.
Thank you, Governor, for your attendance here today. My name is Bill Longworth, and I'm not an economist, but I've been writing since 2006 a blog called fairjobs.ca. So this is the kind of thing I'm interested in. And it seems to me that consumption is the most important thing affecting the health of our economy. It's going to fold if there's no consumption. And yet we have two factors tending to cut consumption, and that is an increasing percentage of jobs in the country are defined as part-time, contract, and casual, to the point about 30% at present, and it's growing. That's taking consumption out of the economy.
Would you please ask your question, sir?
Yeah.
Thank you.
The other problem is the increasing job loss through robotics, which also is cutting out consumption and tending to concentrate the wealth in the hands of the few. So what recommendations would you make, or are these not, in your mind, real problems?
Well, okay, I mean, they are, of course, real problems. And particularly for those whose job is eliminated through technology, I feel a lot of concern for that. As I said before, technology has displaced jobs throughout our history. I could go back to the 1850s and 1860s and see new improvements in farming technology, which we would never want to reverse today, that created unemployment on the farms. But those folks moved into the cities, and what was happening was there were people making farm machinery and providing services and developing other jobs, and the jobs that we know today. Increased specialization, giving rise to more employment growth. So, in fact, historically, technology has created more jobs than it has displaced. And I would point you to how much job growth there has been in the IT services sector of Canada, for instance. These are jobs that pay something like 20 to 30% higher than the average wage in Canada. There are people who are writing software or maintaining machinery, equipment of the sort you describe. Jobs that are just as crucial as the jobs that have been displaced. And there are more of them. This is one of our leading export categories, is IT services. And so it's just one element of growth, which, of course, if we were talking to each other 5 years ago, we wouldn't even think of those things. They just wouldn't exist. So it's out of thin air that these jobs appear. Now, I know that those aren't jobs for the person that was displaced. And that's why I talked about support systems and adaptability being a really important part of our process going forward, because the economy is changing even faster every day. So the problems you raise are real ones. There are like side effects along that trend line, and we need, as a society, to understand them and to help people manage through them. And, well, and that's what progress has always looked like historically.
Governor Poloz, thank you very much. Folks, thank you very much for coming today. Just before we leave, and the governor